So the topic today is the impact of handwritten text recognition technologies on libraries, and we've got two really fantastic speakers here today to join us. I think Paul is going to speak first and then Joe, but I'll introduce both of them just now, just so you have both their introductions before we start, and then they can pass over to each other. So Paul Gooding is Professor of Library Studies and Digital Scholarship at the University of Glasgow. Paul's research focuses on understanding the impact of digital library collections on institutions and users, and how library and archival collections can be harnessed for innovative reuse in the digital humanities. In recent years, his research has explored the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning in libraries, with a particular interest in how we can make AI tools more transparent and understandable for library users. Joe Nockels is a PhD researcher at the University of Edinburgh and Glasgow, funded by the Scottish Graduate School for Arts and Humanities and National Library of Scotland. He focuses on handwritten text recognition from an institutional and user perspective, as well as its implications for the historical method and wider information environment. So thanks a lot for joining us, Paul and Joe. Really delighted to have you. And Paul, I think you're going to kick off, so I'll pass over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean, and lovely to be here with you, with all of you, and with Binky, who is, I'm going to apologize in advance because he is, oh no, he's off, we're good. So he's not going to distract me too much, hopefully, but he has a tendency whenever I'm on a call to suddenly arrive, and that's the moment of the hour of the day when he's desperate for attention. So I apologize in advance if he comes back. So thanks very much, Sean, for inviting both of us today and for the introductions. So I just need to minimize that so I can actually see my notes. So what I'm going to describe as the warm-up act today. So I'm just going to sort of do a 10-minute or so introduction about the wider contexts for AI in the library sector, kind of how I see them and how I contextualize some of the issues around AI and libraries more broadly. And then I'm going to hand over to Joe for a more in-depth study of handwritten text recognition. So for those that aren't familiar, that's software that harnesses AI and machine learning techniques to allow computers to receive and interpret handwritten text from all sorts of documents. And Joe's going to present some of the findings of his PhD research, looking at the use of handwritten text recognition software in the National Library of Scotland. So more on that in a little while. First up, though, just wanted to do a little bit of an introduction to me. So I'm kind of DHer slash librarian. DHer, I mean digital humanities. So I originally, before kind of going back into academia, I did my MA in library studies in the mid-2000s and worked as a librarian in the broadcast media environment for several years. And I'm now a professor. I've been promoted since I wrote this slide. I should have changed that. I'm a professor in information studies, and I primarily teach on a postgraduate master's in archival studies and an undergraduate degree in digital media and information studies. And over the last decade, I've done a lot of work and led a lot of projects around usage of digital collections. And I've gradually found myself over that period of time moving away from looking at digital resources and usage, or I guess incorporating increasingly work on the impact of AI and machine learning into that user environment. And you'll see from the brief descriptions here that the key aspect is around exploring access. So things like access to digital legal deposits, access to digitized text and their metadata, and most recently the Aeolian network, which I'll talk about briefly later on, which is looking at how access to digital records can be enhanced by AI. So what I'm going to do for this talk is sort of talk a little bit about the wider context, and what I'm particularly interested in is how we in the library sector need to cut through the AI hype and center the adoption of AI and machine learning tools very firmly within the frameworks and ethics of our own sector. So I'm going to talk initially about AI hype and the implications for the library sector. So one of the things I've kind of always been interested in is the way that the hype cycle around technologies has such a profound influence on the way that society views the adoption of those technologies. And I kind of introduced this. I think it's familiar to some people. Other people may not have heard of it, which is Betteridge's law of headlines, one of these classic kind of internet-based laws. And Betteridge's law states that any headline that ends in a question mark can be answered by the word no. So this applies really strongly to artificial intelligence. I've done a quick Google search there, and you can see, well, AI kill was the initial search I did, and the auto complete gives us things like, will AI kill us? Will AI kill art? Will it kill search engine optimization, copywriting, blogging, creativity, music, and jobs? Generally, the answer is no. That doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to fundamentally change or influence those things. But as with so many of those headlines, which does X do Y, the answer is almost always no. And this is indicative of the fact that response that Google comes up with, those shows that we're kind of in the midst of an AI hype cycle right now. We'll have all been aware of things like DALL-E, the image production tool. ChatGPT has been all over the headlines. And we're kind of witnessing this hyperbolic debate around technologies, and it's really difficult between the utopianism on the one hand and almost moral panic on the other hand to actually see the real impacts of what's happening with AI right now. And so it's really important to understand how that tenor of the debate informs our own perspectives on new technologies. So in my view, at least, some of the reality of the situation is perhaps not as pronounced in terms of the social and the impacts that we're seeing being talked about in relation to these things. But that's not to say that various aspects of life and work will be unaffected by AI. Technology can be transformational. And if AI is to achieve nothing else in the library space than allow us to deal with digital collections at a non-human scale, then that would be enough to say it's been transformational. I suspect it's going to be able to do much more than that for us. But often that hype tends to encourage us to look in the wrong directions. We get caught up in the idea that AI is going to replace humans, or get caught up in debating whether the notion of creativity is going to need redefining. It's not that they aren't interesting questions, but they're not necessarily immediately relevant to our practices and our work in the library sector. So it's kind of, in my view, worth exploring what the implications are for how AI is being developed alongside this hype as well. And one of the aspects of this is that there's been a big centralization of AI development. So it's true over the years that libraries have innovated in the adoption and use of AI technologies, but it's also notable that many of the major advances that we see being talked about in AI occur outside the sector. So it's not necessarily a critique of libraries as much as a comment on how the modern tech landscape has seen this massive centralization of expertise, technology, and financing. And there's some obvious reasons for this. Developing large-scale AI solutions like ChatGPT is really expensive, requires access to high-performance computing facilities to scrape, analyze, and process the data that's being used. And we're talking about a lot of data here. ChatGPT uses a data set of approximately 600 gigabytes, which is equivalent to around 1.3 million books. And that takes serious processing power to manage effectively. That's beyond the financial and technological capabilities, not just of libraries, but of many organizations around the world. And this is where the quote I've included here comes in. So Whitaker comments that modern AI is fundamentally dependent on corporate resources and business practices, and our increasing reliance on such AI cedes inordinate power over our lives and institutions to a handful of tech firms. And so that's a really important point when we come on to this other thing that Karen Coyle was talking about 6 or 7 years ago, that this is a shift that's happened more widely when it comes to technological innovation. Libraries have really been at the forefront in the late 19th century through to the mid 20th century. They were absolutely at the forefront of innovations in organizational technology. But as that centrifugal force has shifted towards large corporations and towards the quantities of data that we're talking about here, Coyle argues that library technology has fallen behind the general technology evolution. And I think it's this centralization that's at the heart of it. It's centralization and commercialization of both the finance and the technical expertise for doing technology innovation mean that other sectors have fallen behind and ceded that space to companies like those creating ChatGPT. But it's important, I think, to note that that centralization of technology has implications for the power dynamics of AI adoption more broadly, but it's not necessarily true that libraries are passive consumers of this technology, that everything's happening outside and they're just being adopted without reflection and without critique. It's also not true that libraries are not, there's a lot of work being done in libraries to develop interventions that allow us to harness AI and machine learning technologies to enhance the work that we do. So Gasparini and Kortinen note that in response to this space of centralization, that libraries are playing a range of roles in the technology space. They browse library technology reports, join national or international projects to gain the benefits of technology development, and follow the progress of academic publishers and other close partners. And I quite like the little bit at the end with mixed feelings. But I think the other important thing here to look at is a really interesting report that came out by Ryan Cordell in 2020 that really emphasizes that the activities that Gasparini and Kautanen are describing here can sound a little bit passive. They can sound like they're very much responding to what's happening elsewhere, whereas Ryan Cordell's report really shows the level of activity around machine learning technologies in libraries. And he divides up into 4 different categories. The first one is crowdsourcing. Different categories where activity is happening in libraries around AI and machine learning. So crowdsourcing, discoverability in and across collections, everything from clustering and classification, metadata recognition and extraction, tabular data recognition, linking collections, and all sorts of other things there, as well as handwritten text recognition. He also notes the creative and activist interventions that occur. And the final category there is library administration and outreach. So collection management, preservation and conservation, machine learning literacy education, and supporting patron machine learning experiments. So we're seeing this level of adoption and exploration of artificial intelligence tools. But one of the things that I think needs to happen in response, and is happening, as I'm going to talk about in just a moment, is the need to center our own values and our own mission at the heart of this. If that centralization has occurred outside libraries, it means we have to respond to it in a way that for our own practices recenters libraries. So I've borrowed here the 7 ethical principles from CILIP as indicative of the sorts of values that we share as a sector. And through that process of adopting and reflecting on AI tools, we need to center those library missions and ethical values. So quite often I think what is the impact of AI is the wrong question. It's more, how does AI support our mission? In what ways does it challenge our existing missions and values? And how can we as a sector adopt AI tools in a values-driven way? So one of my solutions in recent years, and one of the things that I've both been involved in and follow really closely through other people, is this collaboration is absolutely at the heart of how we respond to this. So I'm just going to go through 2 examples of collaboration in the space. One that I have been involved in, which I'll talk about second, and one which I haven't been involved in, which I've followed with interest and I think is really a really positive step in this. So the first one is AI for LAM, which, as I said, it's the one I haven't been involved in. But AI for LAM is a collaborative effort to create an international participatory community focused on, as they say, advancing the use of artificial intelligence in, for, and by libraries, archives, and museums. So they organize a variety of activities. Annual conference, regular program of events, news on AI in libraries, and they also update a registry of AI-related projects, activities, data sets, and models, which is all really valuable and provides a focal point for communities across libraries, archives, and museums to come together to explore AI and enhance their understanding, enhance sharing of knowledge between institutions. And they're open to all institutions and interested individuals. So anybody who's interested in exploring this further, I'd highly recommend going onto their website and having a look at the sort of things and seeing if there's ways to get involved, because they're a really useful, really valuable organization in this space. The second one I'm going to briefly mention is the Aeolian network. So I was the co-investigator on this project, which ran from 2021 to earlier this year, and it was funded by the AHRC and the National Endowment for Howard, so the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the National Endowment for Humanities in the US. And it was designed to investigate the role that AI and machine learning can play to make born digital and digitized records more accessible. That was really focused heavily on knowledge exchange. So we organized 6 workshops on varied topics across the range of issues, everything from ethics to innovative use to access. We also produced a variety of case studies and reports. These were co-authored by academics and library or archival practitioners to give a really nice balance between the research and the practice focus. And some of them are available on the Aeolian website, and others will be available in a forthcoming open access book that's going to be published by UCL Press in 2024. So there's also a forthcoming special issue in the Journal of Computing and Cultural Heritage. The original call for papers is available online. And again, that's going to be a mix of researchers and practitioners talking and presenting good practice, presenting issues that they're facing in their organizations. So that's my learning outcome from doing that project, is that collaboration between academics and libraries is key. This research practice nexus is really important to foregrounding and helping us to understand not just what we can do in our own organizations, but what other people are doing across the sector. So my very final point, and I'll hand over to Joe after this, and I just wanted to introduce, as I should say as well, for full transparency, I've been talking about transparency and sharing. I'm Joe's PhD supervisor. He's been working with me and Melissa Terras at the University of Edinburgh, and Sarah Ames, who's the Digital Scholarship Librarian at the National Library of Scotland, sorry, for the past few years. And the scheme that's funded his research is called the SAGSA Scottish Graduate School for Arts and Humanities Collaborative Doctoral Award. And these are really important to me. They've become a real key focus of collaboration. They're really valuable both for the PhD students, for supervisors, and I hope also for the organizations that collaborate on providing them. So the idea is to allow students to do a project that is situated within in an academic environment, but allows them to spend anything up to 6 months of their research working very closely with a partner organization that's outside of academia. So as I said, in this case, Joe is working with the National Library of Scotland. And there's a couple of different funding schemes. There's collaborative doctoral awards and advanced research collaboration studentships. And I love these. They're fantastic for me. I won't comment too much on Joe, he can comment as he likes, but they're some of the most fulfilling experiences that I've had as an academic. And what I really love about them is they allow organizations like libraries who have this big issue that they want to have to investigate. And we can bring something that a lot of library practitioners don't have, which is time. We can provide the time for an individual to work really closely on a big issue, engage across the organization with a variety of stakeholders, and bring bodies of knowledge together that are really valuable and beneficial. So I'm going to wrap up there just to say that hopefully this gives a sense of where Joe's work's going to come from, and also the kind of conversations and the things that he's been doing. So Joe's been working on a specific artificial intelligence tool, which is handwritten text recognition, in order to understand better how it impacts not only on the workflows and practices of libraries, but also how it might change usage and engagement with library and archival collections. And inevitably, I've been talking for a little while, so I'm going to shut up here and hand over to Joe. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Paul. No, that's really useful, and I think grounds us in conceptualizing AI, again, with centering those values of the library sector. This talk, or at least my chunk of the webinar, will, I think, move us from conceptualization to the operationalization side. So how do you practically embed AI through handwritten text recognition into that library workflow that Paul was suggesting. So I'm just going to share my screen. and get rid of this horrible toggle bar. There we go. So hopefully that's okay for everyone. So yes, this chunk of the talk is going to be about adopting handwritten text recognition at the National Library of Scotland, and work that we've done on embedding the technology into our workflows. It's broadly a story of how we've gone from 0 in terms of utilising the technology, just using it sporadically on individual projects, to maybe not 100, but about 50 in terms of embedding the technology. And this allows us, or we're seeing this technology as allowing us to meet the aims of our Reaching People strategy. We're due to have another strategy soon, but Reaching People really emphasises harnessing digital engagement in outstanding ways to allow people to connect with our collections. And as part of this, we really need to meet this urgent need of transcribing our historical handwritten collections, so they then can be made searchable, but also enhance digital scholarship from those using our collections as well. This isn't without difficulty. Embedding, as I'll show you in this talk, embedding handwritten text recognition is not a done deal within our workflows. There's still issues that present themselves and challenges. One of those challenges is actually making staff and our users aware of how we are harnessing AI. We had a recent survey conducted by Lucy Dalgleish, who was funded by the Centre for Data, Culture and Society at Edinburgh, to talk to our staff about how they are conceptualising AI, what their worries are, what their fears are, what they think the benefits might be, and a lot of those library sectoral values came out in those conversations. So we're keen to start using that as a base, and then fully engaging with AI methods. So adopting this kind of ethical approach before we start to harness AI fully. So moving on, this is just to give a sense of my part of the talk. So I'll provide a little bit more context on perhaps not the CDA placement, because Paul did really well in terms of describing that. A bit more about handwritten text recognition, specifically Transcribus, which is the tool that we've begun using, and an intro to the Read Cooperative as well, which is the body that maintains and develops Transcribus. We'll show some of the hindrances we've had in adopting HTR and replacing some of our OCR capability. And then part 3 is going to talk about maybe the main considerations that have come out of our work in adopting HTR, that hopefully translate and map onto your institutions as well. And then number 4, if there's time, hopefully there will be, just citing some future work and how we're using handwritten text recognition, but other AI methods in approaching our handwritten collections. So Transcribus is a HTR tool used to convert analog collections into machine readable text. Broadly, it's an AI tool aimed at enhancing user access to collections through automatic transcription. For the most accurate results, Read and Transcribus recommend training a model on about 15,000 words of text for handwritten material. For printed material, it requires a lot less training, considering that those documents tend to be more regimented. This ground truth data and transcription is used to build up sequential links, and the AI algorithm recognizes handwritten text based on language construction and predictions. So the tool can be applied in different ways. It can be trained from scratch, tailored to your own material and collections, or it can be used out of the box, harnessing openly licensed models that can be found within the platform. There's also a mixed approach where you can tailor an algorithm to your own collection and use someone else's model, an openly licensed model, which might have been trained on a similar date of material, a similar hand as a base. So it's not an either-or approach, and part of our work was, in finding out which would best suit the National Library. Transcribus at the moment has two interfaces. There's a web-based client called Transcribus Lite, and also a downloaded Java-based client as well. The developers are wanting to phase out this downloadable version, so there'll be just one, what they're calling a web app, still in the beta stage, but something to be made aware of as well if you come to use the tool. Obviously, other HDR softwares exist with varying degrees of accuracy, but we focus on Transcribus. It's the largest consumer level HDR provider. 10 new models are trained daily, and since 2020, over 20 million images have been uploaded to the platform by approximately 100,000 users as well. Sorry, the slide says 45, so a huge jump between 2020 and 2023. So in terms of the CDA placement, as Paul said, I was funded by the Scottish Graduate School for Arts and Humanities, and this explored how AI methods could be used to transcribe historical heritage collections at the National Library of Scotland. The placement was conducted last year, finished early this year, and my time was split between the digital scholarship team and those at Archives Manuscripts. The first 3 months with Archives Manuscripts was scoping collections, finding materials that we thought would be good candidates for Transcribus and HTR, working with curators to provide an understanding of how HTR might be useful to them. And then with digital scholarship, we conducted a lot of trainings, about 3 or 4 with staff, which were well attended, and 2 actually with our public audiences as well, which gained enough interest to be oversubscribed, which was quite fulfilling. This work culminated into a report to our library leadership team, just under our board of directors, which has sway over investing and directing attention towards new technologies and new methods at the library. So this talk obviously draws quite heavily on that LLT report. The last bit of context I just want to give people is the fact that Transcribus is operated under this cooperative structure. As Paul mentioned, there's this sense that libraries are passive consumers of technology, despite the fact that they might be on the periphery now, but they were making headway in developing a lot of these technologies initially. The cooperative structure flies in the face of that. It's made up of about 80 institutions worldwide who all pay for shares. So the library has 4 shares in Transcribus. In turn, they receive discounts in processing and an active say during regular monthly members meetings and also an annual conference. So as we found, and I'll show you throughout the process, there were elements of Transcribus and HTR that didn't quite meet our structure as an institution, but also the capabilities we wanted. And we're able to then physically, virtually attend those members' meetings and kind of steer attention towards that side of the development of the tool. So we are very much an active voice within the community and not just passive consumers, and there's real strength in that. So the rest of the talk is going to be talking about kind of the reality of operationalizing HTR within our workflows, and as Cox suggested in his SILIP report on AI within libraries, we frame this work against the backdrop of the entire organization of the National Library. Through this, we're able to harness HDR tools more effectively and to see really how they might benefit user communities and internal processes. So to provide a bit of background to how the National Library currently undergoes its text recognition, the library uses OCR, Abby Fine Reader as the engine, which is adopted as part of this quite menacing, daunting looking automated ingest process. So after 2010, during 2010, the library worked with the Internet Archive, and the Internet Archive in that project were applying their OCR alongside compressing their PDFs. They were doing it in one workflow, quite seamlessly. And National Library of Scotland at the time thought that that would be a good way of being able to scale up text recognition on its collections, being able to manage resources. All of this work is broadly conducted by one individual at the library, the Digital Collections Coordinator. So it seemed like a manageable workflow, and continues to work quite well. So the processes you can see on the screen are broadly how the library goes from capturing material to bringing it into its digital assets management system as a standardized kind of image pack and with set file formats. So how does this relate to my work? Obviously it dictates that any change we wanted to make to this workflow would have to work at scale and not disrupt all the other components. So it became quite a tricky piece of work. We couldn't just take the OCR out and put Transcribus in, because Transcribus has its own user interface, it has its own protocols. We needed to find kind of a way to, mesh the two systems. There was a clear need for this, so although that automated ingest process and the NLS's current OCR works quite well on print and reduces overheads and scales very well, on handwritten collections it obviously doesn't work nearly as well and produces quite inaccurate results. So in front of you is a column of one of our newspaper collections, the Scottish Current, 18th century to 19th century newspaper collection. And this is our current OCR and the confidence rate that we got back out. So the redder the square, the less confident the OCR is at recognizing that character. And you can see there's quite a bit of red, especially down one hand side. Whether that's something to do with the digitization, I'm not too sure. But it's not really fit for purpose. And this is a printed text that just has a complex layout. So again, there was a real urgent need to bring in a system, an AI-enabled software that perhaps could do, return a higher character error rate, or character accuracy rate, sorry. So here's a comparison between how Transcribus dealt with a broad range of collections, broad range of dates, broad range of carriers and layouts as well, compared to the NLS's current OCR. And you can see that the HTR accuracy, by and large, is far more accurate. In the case of the Marjorie Fleming diaries, far more accurate. There's a 70% jump almost in accuracy. The exception is the Chapman prints. So in the 1990s, there was a big manual project to correct that output because the OCR, one of the earlier iterations of Abbey, was so inaccurate that really curators had to go back and correct it by hand. So hence why the HTR is slightly lower than the OCR. But it was encouraging to see. The other aspect of the benefits that Transcribus could bring to us is that Abbey Fine Reader, the current Abbey Fine Reader license that the NLS uses, only works on 5 predominant languages, so English, German, French, Italian and Spanish. Transcribus, theoretically, once you feed it enough ground truth data, it can get a sense of the language construction and work in any language, and actually is a tool that is used on non-Western languages by a lot of institutions. Devanagari scripts for Indian manuscripts, for instance, Arabic, even right-to-left languages like Arabic, it tends to perform quite strongly on. So this kind of presents the justification for why we were so interested in AI transcription, but again doesn't quite get away from this daunting automated ingest process that we had to navigate. So in getting our heads around how we might adopt Transcribus opposed to our OCR, there were four main things that really came up. So the first was actually who would be responsible for this model training. You know, it's inescapable that Transcribus needs some form of model training if we were going to get really accurate outputs, especially on handwritten collections. But obviously our curators are hard pressed as it is, dealing with user requests, cataloging, working with stakeholders. So understandably, they weren't keen on the idea that they would then have to go through a lot of manual transcription work to feed that ground truth data into Transcribus. One idea was hiring a point person. This would emulate the National Library of Finland, which currently holds the record for the biggest Transcribus model, which they trained on over 2 million newspaper pages, correcting their insufficient OCR. You know, whether that decision is fit for purpose obviously depends on a range of factors: the size of the organization, the current workflows that are being used, the materials that were being used as well. They very much use Transcribus on newspaper print. So again, there's this trouble with curators who have acquired specialist knowledge to be able to read pre-19th century manuscripts. So it was likely that they were going to be the ones that were using Transcribus the most, and the resourcing issues that come out of that obviously needed to be contended with as well. Again, this is matched though against the fact that Transcribus can be used out of the box using those openly licensed models, and still outperforms OCR in that case. So for a lot of these statistics, the HTR model that we used was one of those openly licensed models that had little training done to it. It still outperformed our OCR. So again, that was really quite encouraging as well. This is maybe where we enter into the collaborative ventures that Paul was talking about, with academic partners who are working in the live area of research, working with AI and collections. Perhaps they can do some of the training. Perhaps, as Cordell suggested, we look towards crowdsourcing as well. Not a particularly new area of work, but perhaps something that the NLS ought to re-engage with, because it has used crowdsourcing in the past. Again, as I suggested, this kind of need to integrate HTR into the automated ingest tool. Transcribus would require additional steps in our processes. It's things like deskewing pages, which we currently don't do for our OCR, but if we were to start doing, because it's good practice for handwritten text recognition, you know, suddenly the manual work needed for those on the digital side increases, with kind of minimal increases in accuracy as part of that. Transcribus are developing new APIs, which you can find on the website. Hopefully this just allows Transcribus to run at scale, but currently we had to reframe HTR as maybe a useful tool, but not an entire OCR replacement, despite its clear improvements in accuracy. The other issue with integrating HTR into our workflows was the server infrastructure. Transcribus are Austrian-based, they're based in Innsbruck, and currently everything runs through their server. It obviously poses issues around GDPR compliance, data sovereignty, outages. In 2022, they did experience quite a major issue in their file protocols, and that resulted in a big kind of outage and downtime. Again, though, there is work being done in this area, so the state archives in Zurich were the first to enter into kind of agreements with Transcribus about having local server infrastructure. They had public access keys. They entered into an agreement about the processing costs. That seemed to work quite well for them, and is something that transcribers are going to roll out in the future. So again, this could build up more computing power and resilience against those outages, and make our curators and our staff a bit less anxious about the data sovereignty requirements. The last bit of the integration is obviously centering the values of the library sector. The last bit of integrating HTR into our ingest protocols was ensuring that those transcriptions would be preserved digitally in a robust way. You know, HTR transcriptions, like any digital object, should be stored with the necessary metadata that aids in their identification, discovery, assessment, and management. And that work should occur within a set structure, such as the digital object database at the NLS or our collection management system. So we were quite keen to have discussions with those who were working on the digital preservation side as well. So moving on in the interests of time. So with all of that considered, the fact that as transcribers now, and considering our own automated processes as well, the fact that we were looking at transcribers maybe not as an entire OCR replacement just yet, but a very, very useful tool that we wanted to embed into our processes nonetheless. We presented to the library leadership team various use cases for how we might finance using HTR, and how we might build on its clear efficiencies as well. So we suggested that the library adopt the user case number 3, so using transcribers on a smaller kind of individual projects. This would allow curators to get even more familiar with the tool. A lot are through our trainings. It would allow models to be built up as well, and processing to continue. And this would manage and limit costs as well. Compared to our AVI Fine Reader license, it's a real minimal cost, especially with the reduced processing that we get as an institutional member of the cooperative. Adopting approach 3 would allow us to move to approach 2, where we use transcribers to train these big core models that give us strategic coverage over our collections. So obviously for us, Gaelic is a really important consideration, English, Latin, French as well, and also non-Western scripts. We have a lot of Hebrew in our collections, we have a lot of Arabic in our collections as well. So we presented that idea of moving from 3 to 2, and then maybe with these APIs, with a new server infrastructure, with work that we're currently also undergoing. The NLS is undergoing a big project to revamp and reframe its digital asset management system, really building it from scratch again. So once all of this is done, perhaps we can move to that first approach, where HTR is used as a complete ABI Fine Reader replacement, as it's better not only on handwriting but also on printed materials. And even then, the cost is only marginally higher than the ABI Fine Reader license is currently costing the NLS as well. So again, lastly, before we perhaps begin to wrap up, centering those values that Paul talked about and the values that Silip kind of helpfully showcase as well. We considered the potential implication for adopting HTR on the NLS's data ethics framework. So Steph broadly suggested that the NLS could probably deal with adopting HTR within its existing suite of data ethics policies and safeguards. And this follows work by Chu in 2021, who reviewed how content holding institutions are grappling with framing their collections more inclusively and sensitively. she presented this great report to the NLS about how we need to update our descriptions to reflect changing language and also use content filters elsewhere. Broadly, the more handwritten text that we transcribe and make available to the public, of course that enhances digital scholarship, it enhances users to be able to engage with our collections. It also potentially opens us up to making discoveries about quite dark areas of the past. So we really need to manage that and take that seriously, establish these ethical frameworks before fully entering into adopting HTR fully. Again, AI tools could be used alongside AI-enabled transcription to pull out sensitive information, things like contact details, bank account numbers in some of our business archives, individuals' names, named identities as well. Of course, whilst keeping the human in the loop to check that work as well. The other element that came up in discussions and this SAGSA placement to do with data ethics was whether we should be making users more aware that these transcriptions are being breached through AI-enabled methods, whether we provide them a general disclaimer on the website. That should be quite interesting in the comments if anyone's got an approach to this. A general disclaimer about potential inaccuracies in our transcriptions, providing detail on how transcriptions were reached, or actually file level flags that we can select and deselect based on whether we're using HTR or not for that collection. That would obviously increase the level of resourcing, probably wouldn't be the most streamlined approach, but certainly would offer more information to our users. So again, a real consideration in our adoption of Transcribus. So lastly, just to cite some future work taking us away from just AI-enabled transcription, we also ran a drop-in session looking at kind of AI scanning approaches. So this is a scan tent. It's basically a portable digitization station. It's also developed under Reed, the Innsbruck-based company that developed Transcribus, and can be coupled together with Transcribus. So it allows for the capture of documents, obviously not a replacement for actual V-shaped scanners or our mass digitization unit, but to be used by curators kind of in a more ad hoc way, maybe with project partners. Its image detection or page detection kind of algorithms are quite strong. It's also got an automatic capture function. Every time you turn a page, it will take a new image. That can be then compressed into a PDF of all the pages and uploaded to Transcribus where the HTR can be performed. There's various use cases. You don't need to couple it with Transcribus. You can just use the portable digitization station and download those PDFs into cloud storage. But it creates this kind of HTR ecosystem from scanning to then making documents publicly available. So it's something, again, we're quite interested in. And we're actually trialing one of these scan tents in our special collections reading room right now with curators, again, kind of critiquing it as it's being used. So that's one element of future work. Another element of future work is kind of this more experimental approach to handwritten text recognition. Because handwritten text recognition is coupled with other algorithms, so really robust layout analysis compared to OCR, again, this binarization tools, so being able to prize off the text from a background page image, it's actually quite robust at materials away from just standard handwritten collections. It's able to pick up music notation. Actually describing that music notation as you come to transcribe it is a bit tougher. So again, experimental, not exactly a standard approach or a robust approach. But here's an experiment, and you can see that it does quite well in picking up the notation on our Glen collection of printed music. We also used HDR for automatic metadata extraction on some of our maps. So we don't expect transcribers to pull out the main map content, all the topographical features. There's obviously so much text that's overlapping, so many things that could be interpreted as baselines or margins. So taking a step back, we kind of thought HDR might not be useful in that use case, but it could be quite good at picking out things like print codes that we need in our metadata that always appear in the same area of the map. So this is, you can just see the kind of pink highlighting down here in the bottom of the image. This is the print code, and it's almost always in that lower left-hand side of the image. So again, we were able to feed that into the algorithm, so transcribers knows only to focus on that area and what we want from it. Anthropomorphizes the technology a little bit, but that was broadly the approach. So this again is being trialed in our, in our maps department right now. And again, this is useful because it reduces the manual labor from map curators. They don't have to go through and adopt a laborious approach in writing out these print codes. Our OS map collections are also, it's hundreds of thousands of map pages. So any, as Paul was saying, kind of any way we can use HDR to reduce the effort as we scale up our approaches is pretty transformative. So those are the two main elements of future work. We're also trying to bring the developers of Read more closely together with staff, again having this more active say within the cooperative, building up this technical fluency in using HDR tools as well through more training, and centering our music creators are quite interested in using HDR music, our map curators are quite interested in using HDR maps, so we're centering those discussions as well. So to conclude, hopefully very whistle-stop tour that this section of the webinar has displayed to you some of the persistent issues in OCR approaches and the potential for AI-enabled transcription to produce better results and more accurate transcriptions. I've also presented to you a practical study of how we might go about embedding some of those methods institutionally, and hopefully that serves as a useful roadmap for other libraries. Of course, lots of hindrances, lots of hurdles to still overcome, but actively engaging in this space, I'm sure we'll come to resolutions as well. So thank you for listening. Welcome any questions in the chat. Seems like we've got a few minutes. So happy to clarify anything as well. I'll just stop screen sharing.
Great. Thank you, Joe. Thank you for presenting something that can seem on the surface as a very complex topic so accessibly and breaking it down so well. So really appreciate that. All of that was really, really interesting. Thank you so much. And I think it really shows, the moving on of the conversation. So many things I've attended about AI are more kind of high level, and it's really good to see something fairly local and where it's a real application of that, where ethics and values are still at the centre of what we're doing. So yeah, I mean, if anyone wants to add any questions to the chat, thanks to Paul also for that brilliant overview. I know we've got one question, just quick question from Midra. So that model of the transcribers being a co-op, do you think, is this quite a good model, do you think, for other tools? Is it happening elsewhere with other types of tools, or do you think it would be a good model to ensure that there is some more collaboration and ethical thought around the use of these tools, having libraries and other institutions actually part of the almost ownership of them?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think it's not a particularly common structure. So with transcribers based in Austria, it's a scientific development community. I can't quite remember. SCE is the strapline. But yeah, it was quite innovative when it was proposed 2-3 years back. It served to be a good model. I think members feel actively involved. Main considerations, the institutions have, as and when they have them, are able to be expressed. A big one at the moment is obviously contending with the climate crisis, the actual environmental cost of HDR processing. I think a lot of institutional members have expressed that, and that's led Reed to consider that in greater detail. So yeah, I think it's definitely something to adopt. Our OCR being Abbey Fine Reader, it was kind of the company that embed it into our approaches. This is getting into the weeds a little bit. So they do the PDF compression, but they also do the OCR, is Luratech. And they've always been good, whenever curators have had issues, they're very timely. But it's very much this top-down interaction that we have a technical fault or technical issue, we come to them, they solve it. We're not quite aware of what they're doing behind the scenes in the back end. We're just happy that the process is working again. So yeah, I think it's definitely something to consider.
Great, thank you. No,
just to add, just to add to that, Sean, as well. So the question you asked about the co-op and who else is doing it is something that we've discussed, and I think it's something that actually is a really good point to do further investigation. And we're kind of in the early stages at the minute of sort of doing a little study, basically looking at the transcribers user community and surveying them to ask them, because it's kind of almost an open question for us as well, asking them what they think of the co-op model. What benefits do they see it providing? Do they think it should be adopted elsewhere? So hopefully at some point in the next year, we might have some sort of concrete evidence from the user community as to how they perceive the benefits of the co-op, which I think will be a really nice sort of addition to this debate.
Great, thank you, Paul. And just to come to the chat, I know we've got a couple of minutes left, but I don't know if you want to just touch quickly on Andrew's question about academic departments.
Yeah, I was just having a think about that. So my initial reaction, as I said to Andrew in the chat, was it's a really good question, and the immediate thing that springs to mind is this question of documentation and preservation, because that's something that the libraries are fantastic at, that perhaps academics don't have full knowledge of. And if we're thinking of it from the perspective of supporting academics, I was kind of thinking about it in relation, I guess, from my side, I almost see two types of tools being developed here. There's the first type, which is academics working on AI and machine learning tools, which perhaps don't use the collections of libraries in certain disciplines. So things like documentation preservation, understanding transparency, understanding fair data principles, all those kind of things are things that could be really helpful for the academic communities to have support on there. But I was also thinking a little bit about the second category, which is AI and machine learning tools, which actually utilize the collections of libraries. And I think that brings in a really interesting question. Andrew mentioned copyright, which is absolutely one of the essential things there. But I think there's also questions about collections understanding there. Things like, going back to Joe's point about data ethics, understanding what is and isn't in the collections, what is and isn't usable for the purposes of AI, and understanding and foregrounding the biases and the gaps that are in our collections. And I think all of those things are kind of really important. And it comes back to that sort of the information professionals collections understanding, which is always going to, I think, however well trained an academic is, an information professional is always going to have a more holistic and deep understanding of the collections of their institution as a whole than an academic can. So that's a point, I think, of both supporting academics, but real potential for collaboration there as well.
Thank you very much, and I hope that answers your question, Andrew. But do get in touch if you want to keep that conversation going. I'm conscious of time, and I think an hour for these always we always get close to the last minute. So I'm sure we could discuss this in much more detail, but I think we'll have to wrap up there. So just to say thank you so much, Paul. That was a brilliant overview, and Joe, a fantastic project. Do keep us up to date with things, and thank you to everyone else for joining us. And if we can just show our thanks for the two speakers in any way you would like to, and we really appreciate your time on this. We'll send round a recording and evaluation after the event to everyone, so if you can fill that in, and do share the recording with your networks if you can. So thanks all, and hope everyone has a good weekend.